Hey folks, I'm back with round 5 of my recent tournament, the Minnesota GM Norm round robin. So in round 5, I was playing against actually a good friend of mine, FIDE Master Gauri Shankar. Gauri was actually my roommate for the event, so we were staying together. And I mean, we roomed before, so we go back quite a few years. So yeah, Gauri, I mean, he's technically an FM, but he already has like I think 5 or 6 IM norms or something, so he just needs to get the rating to 2400. So I mean, clearly just like a very good player. I think he was like the bottom seed in the tournament, but definitely didn't feel like I was playing down this game or anything like that. Going into this round, I had 2 out of 4, and by this point, since the to get a norm in the event, one needed to score 6.5 points out of 9. That basically meant for me, I would need to score 4.5 points in the last 5 games to reach 6.5, which of course is quite difficult. And I was already thinking about how I'm going to exactly try to win out like the rest of my games and only give up 1 draw. Which is, I think, a specific concern of norm tournaments, because you kind of know exactly how many points you need to score, and once you're kind of far from your goal and you basically have to win the rest of your games, it can become very tough to play while also keeping that goal in the back of your mind. But anyway, I mean, I just tried to take the game as it is. I have been in a situation before. Actually, I made my last IM norm needing to win, I think, 3.5 out of my last 4 games. Or something like that. And it was very tough, but I just managed to take it like 1 game at a time. In fact, in one of those games, I happened to beat Gauri, so that was a good memory. But yeah, I think it's kind of a special pressure that only shows up in these kinds of round robins. Okay, so I played d4, knight f6, c4, and now g6 was played, which was already pretty big surprise for me, because to my knowledge, Gauri was not much of a King's Indian or a Grunfeld player. So I spent a few minutes here just trying to figure out, number one, is he trying to go for the King's Indian or for the Grunfeld? My inclination was that he wanted to play a Grunfeld because he knows that I'm a King's Indian player, and I probably have some ideas about how to play against my own opening. So I would imagine from his point of view, it would feel very risky to try the King's Indian. And the Grunfeld is theoretically just extremely sound, and I mean, a very good opening overall. So to me, it felt like the Grunfeld was more likely, but yeah, I still wasn't exactly sure. In the past, I've played the move f3 in this position, which I think is an interesting line, especially against Grunfeld players, because after d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, white can go e4, and there's no knight on c3 for black to capture, and this is considered kind of a small win for white. But okay, this line is extremely sharp, and of course I had no idea what exactly Gauri prepared, what he didn't prepare, because I have had games with f3 before. So yeah, it was already difficult just to figure out which line to choose. Eventually I just decided to play knight c3, just allowing the classical Grunfeld, which did take place. He goes d5, takes, e4, and I decided to go for a line that I've played before that I felt reasonably familiar with, that is knight f3, c5, and bishop e3. I think this is one of the best ways of dealing with the Grunfeld even today. Recently Magnus has been playing this, so I think he's been starting with bishop e3 with idea to meet c5 with a quick rook c1, but this line typically transposes into a lot of these knight f3 lines because white is usually developing the knight to f3 anyway. Yeah, after I played bishop e3, black played queen a5. In the past here, I've mainly played the move knight to d2, which I think is a very interesting move, especially if black is not prepared to deal with it. But I figured, since I've played this a couple of times and I've likely played it recently, if Gauri had looked at anything, he would probably have looked at this line. So I didn't really want to have to try and remember my prep, because this is not a line I've looked at in some time. So I decided to play queen d2, which is actually just the main line in the position. And I don't have a ton of knowledge here, but I figured, since there wasn't a whole lot of time to prep for the game, Gauri likely didn't look at this too carefully or too deeply, and we would both be kind of somewhat out of book early on. which I was fine with because, I mean, I'm definitely trying to play for a win in this game, and we get a sharp Grunfeld where neither opponent knows exactly what they're doing, means there's going to be a lot of potential for play usually. Okay, so after a little bit of thought, he castled here, and I decided to play rook to b1. And in fact, this move is playable, but actually nowadays rook c1 is kind of considered the overwhelming choice for white in this position. I think I actually just got my lines mixed up here because I know after knight c6, rook c1 in this position has been kind of considered the main move traditionally. Rook b1 has been the trendy favorite in the last, I don't know, 10-15 years or so. So this is kind of what I was thinking about. Okay, I should play the more trendy move rook b1, but it's actually kind of a different story if black castles first, doesn't commit to knight c6. Then here, for whatever reason, I haven't looked into it too deeply, rook c1 is just considered the main choice. Because in these lines, I mean, the rook clearly does stand very well on c1. The point is to defend the pawn so that white can push d5, whereas the rook on b1 simply doesn't do this, and so white isn't ready to play d5 yet. So for some concrete reason, I guess after knight c6, rook b1, white can get away with this here, maybe because rook b5 is kind of an annoying threat in this position. But after castles, rook b1, this doesn't seem to be as critical, mainly for the reason that black played in the game, which is to take on d4, c takes d4, and just trade queens. And this is an option that black usually has in this line with queen a5 and queen d2. And these endgames, I think, are always hard to judge whether white can play for some edge or not. It's always a choice, actually, how to recapture on d2. But one thing is clear, though, is that this rook, I think, would stand better in this position on c1 for the reason that we'll see in the game. I chose to play bishop takes d2 here, and then after black pushed b6, it became clear that now my rook is not really doing much against the b file. b6 is a super useful move from black's point of view because the bishop can often use either b7 or a6 in this type of position, and so the rook on c1 would just be better placed because I have immediate access to c7. So that's kind of one of the key differences between putting the rook on b1 and c1. So playing rook b1, I would say, was maybe my first kind of slight inaccuracy. And then after queen takes d2 here, I spent a little bit of time because I just had no idea how I should recapture. It turns out king takes was the right way to do it in this position. I mean, these positions are very tough to figure out, to be honest. For example, let's say I had played rook c1, as Magnus did in this position, or at least he reached this position against Mamedyarov in a recent game. And so in their game, black took on d4 and took on d2. I believe this was actually their Armageddon game in Norway chess that Magnus ended up winning. And in this position, Magnus took with the knight. Which I believe is the correct choice. But why exactly it's correct to take with the knight here, but in the position we got in the game with the rook on b1, you're supposed to take with the king, it's just something I'm going to have to dig a little bit deeper and investigate, because these move orders are often very, very non-trivial to figure out. Okay, I mean, I believe at this point it's better to take with the king because I can develop my pieces quicker. I don't have to waste time defending the d4 pawn, as does happen in the game. And I simply just want to get the second rook to c1 in this position, which makes sense here. After bishop takes d2, as I played in the game, the reason I decided to take with the bishop is I just felt like I do want to keep the option open to castle, so not moving my king. I'm really not sure if this is so relevant in this position, so yeah, maybe it was definitely just a better option to take with the king. Okay, so black goes b6, which I think was a very useful move, and I spent some time here. Eventually I chose bishop d3. I just figured, okay, this is the most natural square for the bishop. It's kind of defending the e4 pawn preemptively, and maybe I can play king e2 and actually put my king on a nice square in the center. But then Gauri found, I think, a really good move here, bishop g4, which I totally underestimated, because of course, once black plays b6, you're kind of assuming the intention was to play bishop b7. I mean, especially because it is a very natural square for the bishop in this diagonal. But no, bishop g4 is just a concrete idea. Black is putting a lot of pressure on the d4 pawn, and already we can see the drawbacks of white having to waste time of playing bishop takes d2. Now I'm kind of forced to go back bishop e3. Black took on f3, g takes f3, and knight c6. And yeah, I think this was fully correct from black's point of view, because now my d4 pawn is under a lot of pressure, and I have to advance d5. So I did. Black goes knight e5, and now white actually again has a pretty significant choice. We could play either bishop e2 or king e2 to kind of keep everything protected. I was actually considering a third option, this like, let's say alpha 0 type sacrifice with bishop a6. The point being to sacrifice a pawn, but take the c8 square under control. In fact, Magnus beat MVL in this way very recently, I think, at the Croatia Grand Chess Tour event. He didn't have to sacrifice a pawn to get this, but he got his bishop to a6, covered the c8 square in a very similar endgame, and it was just very difficult for black to deal with this because white's rooks were able to penetrate to the 7th rank and just totally dominate the position. But here, I mean, I think white does get some compensation, but black can grab a very clear pawn with knight takes f3 check, king e2. And now if black goes knight e5 here, then I think white gets some very significant compensation after like rook c1, threatening either rook c7 first, or also some ideas of like pushing f4 and e5 and just kind of shutting out the dark squared bishop. And yeah, this position I think actually would be very unpleasant for black to play. I think white is just having a lot of pressure, and it's very hard for black to use the extra pawn. But the issue is that after king e2, knight d4 check, white doesn't have such a great response to this. I can go king d3. If not, then black is very quick to play f5 and just generate enough counterplay, and then black is kind of up a pawn for free. But after king e2, knight d4 check, king d3, okay, black is not in time to play f5 because we're hitting the knight, but black can go knight f3. Now f5 is again an idea, and okay, according to Stockfish, white doesn't have anything better than just king e2, allowing a repetition with knight d4 check, king d3, knight f3, and so on. Kind of an interesting line. I mean, neither side can really fight for more, because if white gives up for one tempo, black will play f5 and just generate tons of counterplay, whereas if black spends a move trying to consolidate, white will get a rook to c7 and immediately have a lot of play as well. So okay, an interesting idea, but objectively wouldn't lead to more than a draw, and that's kind of what I felt during the game. Like, I didn't see a good way out of this knight takes f3, knight d4 check idea, and I think taking on d4, going into the endgame with bishops of opposite color, I mean, sometimes you can create some pressure here, but I think black's bishop would just be way too solid on d6 or e5, and yeah, I think it would be very hard for white to do anything with the c file here. Okay, so I also thought about playing bishop e2, which is, I think, the most natural move, just keeping the bishop on the board, defending the f-pawn, and preparing to push f4. But I wasn't quite sure what to do after just a simple move rook a c8, where black wants to play either rook c2 or knight c4, and it just feels like white is kind of underdeveloped here. And if I like castle, for example, knight c4, or rook c2 there might be super annoying as well. I just felt like I'm going to have to give up one of my bishops anyway, and I feel like I'm just wasting time. So with that in mind, I decided to play king e2, thinking like I probably can't hold on to the bishop pair anyway. I'm going to have to trade it off for this knight one way or the other, so I might as well improve my king and bring my king into the center, which I think was reasonable. Black decides to just take on d3 right away. King takes d3, and now e6. Which I think is a good move, because he's kind of challenging my space advantage, trying to trade off some pawns and leave me with some like long-term weaknesses, these double pawns. Also, if allowed, black wants to play rook d8 and just put a lot of pressure on d5. So I wasn't too concerned about this. I had realized already that I definitely lost my chance to like fight for some kind of advantage in the opening. I mainly just blamed it on not being super familiar with the line and knowing exactly how white is supposed to put pressure. And I think I made 2 inaccuracies like right off the bat with rook b1 instead of rook c1, and then not recapturing on d2 properly. But I still had some optimism that maybe I could try to find some play in this endgame. I took on e6, which I think was pretty much forced. F takes e6 and king e2. So yeah, I mean, I felt like this was objectively, should be very, very close to equal, this type of endgame. But I also felt like maybe white has some stuff to play for. The main advantage I was trying to use is the fact that my king is kind of closer to the center, and that typically helps in this kind of endgame because the king can contribute to the fight, can control squares, defend pawns, go for the initiative. I was already thinking entertaining thoughts that, like, if all the rooks were traded off, for example, then my king could try to run to the queen side, and if my king was closer, then this would be, really good bishop endgame for white. But okay, objectively, I felt like black should be totally fine, and there's just, there's always room to go wrong for both sides here. Okay, so black played rook c8, I played rook c1, and yeah, so now my idea is just to go rook hd1 and then maybe trade rooks at some point and go rook to d7 or rook d8 check if allowed, and then back to d7. I think black has to be somewhat precise here, but I think I was just being way too optimistic during the game. It just feels like it's just totally equal, like black has no reason to be worse here and has a lot of like completely reasonable moves. Gauri chose bishop b2, and I think he offered a draw around this point, or maybe one move before, one move after, I'm not sure. Which I definitely thought about taking, because I felt like like I have basically no advantage. If I win this game, it's because my opponent would have to just make like several mistakes in a row and just like allow me to get some initiative. But at the same time, I just felt like I have to try, because I need 4.5 out of 5 for the norm. If I draw this game, then I just need 4 out of 4, and I have a lot of strong opponents coming up, so zero guarantee that I'll have good chances of winning all 4 games. And I felt like since I'm not really worse in the position, then at least I should try to play on, because as long as there's room for black to go wrong, I would feel like I wasn't trying to utilize my full chances in the game just by acquiescing to a draw. So yeah, maybe against a high rated player, I would have just taken the draw and not thought too much about it. But I just felt like, okay, as long as I have, in my mind, I was thinking like 5% chance of winning, 5% chance of losing, and 90% chance of draw. I felt like, okay, as long as my chances to lose are not greater, then there's no reason for me not to continue and just see what happens. All right, so I decided to play on. I took on c8, rook takes c8, and I played rook d1, and now rook c2 check. Okay, so here I felt like I had a big choice. The move I really wanted to play would be king f1 here, because king d3 kind of blocks the rook, and I didn't want to trade rooks. I just felt like white would have absolutely no advantage in the bishop endgame. So I first thought about king f1 here, and the idea is, okay, black is probably going to move the bishop somewhere to try and attack the a-pawn. In the meantime, I'm going to try to come in with rook d8 check, maybe rook d7, and pick up the a7 pawn. But the problem is black can go bishop f6, so covering d8, and I'm not really in time with rook d7 because rook takes a2 just covers the a-pawn. So I didn't really see what I can do here. I thought about this move e5, but to me it just didn't look like white was really getting enough here. After, let's say, bishop takes e5, I could give check and give another check, and let's just say king f6. If I take on a7, black will take on h2. I can take on h7, but then I think black can just bring the bishop back, and now the a2 pawn is hanging, so I don't really have time to take on b6. And I just felt, yeah, some position like this, I think black might even have something better at some point, just offered no advantage for white whatsoever. So this didn't really look like anything. So yeah, my next choice was to think about king d3. And I was a little bit more excited about this one because at least here I think I'm not letting black simplify the position. I figured black might want to go rook c3 check, king d2, and rook a3, going after the pawn. And then after like king c2, for example, can't really take on a2 because king b3 and looks like black loses material. But black can go, let's say, bishop f6. I'd probably play king b1 to defend the pawn. And again, I felt like, okay, white has no advantage, but at least the game keeps going. Black has to keep making moves, and I hold on to like that 5% chance of my opponent making a mistake that I can capitalize on. Because yeah, I still want to put my rook on d7. It's very hard to see how white can make progress, but well, yeah, still the game would probably continue and should be about equal. I don't know. The more I thought about it at this point, I just felt like in that position, I just have very little. And I don't know, I think during the game, at first I was feeling more optimistic. Then I looked at this one, I felt like my winning chances are very, very slim. I looked at the line with king f1, bishop f6, and like e5, and I felt like I'm not really seeing much there. I can also play a move like a4 in this position, but then black can play like rook c4 or even rook c7 is totally fine, and it's just very, very hard for white to create any chances here. Now black's king is not even farther from the center. So yeah, the more I looked at these lines, the more I just started getting more and more pessimistic about my chances. And eventually I just decided, you know what, I'm not going to win this game. Let's just shut it down and make a draw. So I actually ended up playing rook d2 here. This was like the third of my options, the one I considered kind of the least seriously. And from my point of view, I just felt like, okay, I can play this move and basically shut the game down, and we make a draw from here. Objectively, I think it would have been easier either with king f1 or king d3 just to make a quick draw, but we'll get into that later. So rook d2, black takes on d2, king takes d2, and now he plays bishop e5, which is definitely a very accurate move. Like I mentioned before, I mean, white's only chance in this endgame would be to play king d3, king c4, king b5, king a6, and just get the king in. But black is well in time simply to put the bishop on c7 and then put the pawn on a6, which actually keeps the king out. So I mean, I already realized, you know, that black has a very easy defense before trading rooks. So basically what I figured is, okay, bishop e5, I decided to play f4, bishop c7, king d3, king f7, I played h3, king e7, and king c4. And so around here, I think I just offered a drawback because it was, you know, I felt like, okay, I have no winning chances after black plays a6. White has no way of bringing in the king. Black can just use his king on the center and queenside just as well. Black has no real weaknesses other than this b6 pawn, which is super easy to defend, and black can also play like b5 at any moment if they want. So yeah, I just felt like, okay, game over. I have no more winning chances. My opponent offered me a draw a couple moves ago. I declined. Now I'm ready to make a draw, so it's like, you know, my turn to offer the draw. But then Gauri declined the draw, which, you know, I realized actually, yeah, not that surprising once you start taking a closer look at the position. And it turns out that actually, yeah, black has a little bit of an edge here in this bishop endgame. The main point being is that black actually has a potential outside pass pawn with this 2-on-1 on the queen side. And now black just has like this easy plan of bringing the king to c6, just pushing like a6, b5, and then a5, and just slowly advancing. And it's actually very difficult for white to really do anything. I don't have any good play on the king side. My bishop is just kind of a bad piece. And if I play h4 at any moment, then black just plays h5, and of course, you know, secures my pawn on a dark square, which would be a big liability. So yeah, basically, I started getting a little bit annoyed here because I realized like I had a very, very safe position, and all of a sudden I'm like slightly worse than a bishop endgame and having to defend something that like I really had no business being in. I should have just going back a few moves. In this position, chosen either of the king moves like king d3, king f1, things stay pretty much balanced and equal, and I'm sure the game would be probably agreed drawn soon. But yeah, I mean, it was basically just a little bit of carelessness. I felt like, okay, any move draws. To me, trading rooks seemed like the simplest way to just shut the game down, like secure the draw, because we're left with this kind of simplified bishop endgame. And just to my my amateur eyes, it looked like kind of a simple position. Like white tries to get the king in, black goes a6, and then nothing either side can do. But this was just a little bit naive because once we got here, it was not hard for black to figure out that actually if anyone is better here, it's black. So yeah, going back to the game after king f7, h3, king c4, a6. So yeah, at this point, Gauri has already realized that he's better and should just play for the win, which I think is an absolutely justified decision because objectively only black can win here. So I played f3. I think this was a pretty safe move. According to the engine, actually I could have just gone ahead and played f5. And I thought about this. I just thought it was kind of too early for desperate measures like sacrificing a pawn. The idea is that after black takes on f5 twice, white goes king d5, and the activity of the king really compensates for the missing pawn. It's very hard for black to push the queen side without the king being active and putting pressure on these pawns. I mean, black is still objectively better, I mean, extra pawn, but Stockfish couldn't really find a way to make progress. So most likely this position would be drawn. So kind of an interesting one. Sometimes, you just have to take these immediate measures to make sure you don't lose the game. But okay, I didn't think it was so necessary yet, so I just played f3. Black goes king d6, bishop c1. I wasn't sure about playing a4 here. I felt like it's a risky move to play because if I play a4, then I'm basically guaranteeing that black is going to be able to make a pass pawn very quickly. So let's say king b4, check, king c4, and b5, and black is getting outside pass b pawn. And so I was very concerned about this position. I mean, at this point, I already realized like I'm worse. I'm about to be much worse if I'm not careful. So I really have to buckle down and make sure I don't lose the game. And yeah, I really was concerned about this position because it just felt like, okay, now black has this very strong pass pawn. He has pressure against the f4 pawn, like this is a chronic weakness. And he has ideas of playing like bishop c5. I can never trade bishops anymore because the king and pawn endgame is just completely lost. And I wasn't sure how to evaluate some situation like this where black just tries to use the outside pass pawn as a decoy and just bring in the king. It looked very scary. Objectively, the position is probably drawn after a move like king b4. I think bishop b4 is also okay. And it's kind of a common theme in bishop endgames. I just really wasn't sure if it was working here. But basically, black's king is just not able to get in to white's position. Black can definitely try, but it's hard to achieve. Like bishop c5 check, king b3. Let's say bishop comes back this way. White goes bishop e3 and cuts the king off using the bishop. And if black's king can't get in, then it would be very difficult for black to make progress. And most likely the game should be drawn. I wasn't sure about that one, so I decided just to leave the pawn on a2 and make it harder for black to create a pass pawn. But I think playing a4 would have been an easier way to hold the position. Okay, so he goes king c6, king d4. Actually, already king b5 here was a very interesting way for black to play, just kind of trying to bring in the king first and then advancing the pawns later. I think objectively, white might have to just go for immediate counterplay with f5. And I think I ran this line through Stockfish, and it was basically leading into some queen endgame where black is going to have an extra pawn on the queen side. So as you can imagine, white makes a queen, black makes a queen, has this extra a pawn, and then has great winning chances, because I think queen endgames like this are always super dangerous, especially with my king kind of badly placed in the center. Okay, so objectively, I think that would have given black very serious winning chances right off the bat. Gauri decided to play b5, which I guess we can consider somewhat inaccurate because should lead to a drawn position, whereas king b5 I think keeps black's winning chances well alive. And yeah, that just goes to show that white really should have played a4 here, and then just I think this would be quite holdable. Okay, so king d4, b5 was played. I played bishop d2, bishop d6. So I understood that my main idea here is just to keep the king from getting in. I'm trying to keep the c5 square under control, and it's important that black cannot really play b4 super early, because if white can just play king c4 here, then it'll be very hard for black to make a lot of progress. Like he can push the pawn to a5 and a4. I'll put the bishop on d2 though, and the b4 pawn will be weak. And even if the pawn does get to a4 somehow and the king gets to a5, it's not clear how black can make progress from there. So basically white's king on c4 would be really nicely placed. So black starts shuffling here. I think he plays the position quite well. In fact, I think my opponent was in at least approaching time trouble and didn't have a lot of time to figure out how to properly push this endgame. But he did a good job of just not hurrying and just kind of slowly probing around, trying to poke around, see if he can kind of break down my defense. Bishop c7, bishop c1, a5. I realized I should just not be doing anything except shuffling. If black goes bishop b6 check here, then he has to be worried about king e5, where white does get just very quick counterplay, and king d7 is kind of going backwards. And if anything, I mean, this would just be fantastic for white, because I'm able to finally trade off some pawns, create a passed pawn, create some counterplay. So black has to be very careful not to let the king into e5. He goes king d6. Trying to threaten bishop b6 check, also seeing if he can provoke me into pushing e5, which would kind of make my structure much weaker and also potentially give up the d5 square as well. But I just stayed put, king c3. I think this is a useful move. I'm still in time, like b4, king c4 is okay, and king c3, I can play bishop e3 check and kick him out. He goes bishop b6, king d3. Again, king c5 is met with bishop e3 check, and black can't make progress. So he goes, after king d3, king c6. I play bishop c1, bishop d8. And yeah, here I realized that black is now threatening to play king c5. So my first instinct was to play bishop e3. Since king d4, this would kind of walk into bishop f6 check. And then if I didn't want to let the king in, I would have to play e5, which I think is very undesirable for white. So my first instinct was bishop e3, which just looks like the most natural move. But somehow I ended up overthinking it and just confusing myself. I thought black probably plays bishop f6, like putting the bishop on this diagonal anyway. And if I move my bishop off of e3, it seems like black can get the king into c5 anyway. And if I like move my king or something like king c2, well then black can play b4 and he's in time to play king b5. My king doesn't get to c4, and black is going to play a4 and then king c4 and just make a ton of progress right away. So yeah, I don't remember exactly what happened, but somehow I just didn't notice that like bishop d2 hits the a5 pawn. Actually no, I did see this. I saw that, okay, this is preventing king c5, because if black has to go back bishop d8, then I can just play bishop e3, and I'm kind of keeping the fortress. But I wasn't sure how to evaluate the position after a4. I figured, okay, if a4 happens, I would probably have to play bishop b4. And yeah, somehow I wasn't sure about this, because black can still try to bring the bishop around to c5, and if we trade bishops, it looks like I'm dealing with a distant passed pawn. Well, yeah, apparently white is still holding here. Like if bishop d8, bishop f8 can be played, bishop c7, king d4, for example, bishop d6, bishop h6, and it turns out white is fine here. Like if black gives check, then again, has to be careful about the king coming in to e5. Or I can even drop back, and then once the bishop moves, my bishop can, or my king can still keep trying to stop the king from coming into c5. Okay, so this was not, super simple to figure out, but logically, it does feel like the only reasonable choice for white, because if we let the king into c5, then black is just going to be able to make a ton of progress right away. But yeah, somehow I convinced myself that I need to play bishop d2 here. And my idea was just to tie black down to this a5 pawn so that he can't play bishop f6. But this simply allows black to play king c5. And now if bishop e3 check, then black is just going to walk in with the king to b4. And this king is coming to a3. I mean, I can drop back to defend the pawn, but suddenly the position is extremely scary, and it's probably just losing for white. Black can go b4, and then just b3, trade off these pawns, kind of like the old Rubinstein idea when he did it with his king on h3 in that rook endgame. But basically trade off these pawns, his king is super active on b3, and just walk his king over to the king side and win the game over there. So yeah, this is already looking incredibly scary for white. And yeah, I'm not really sure what happened there, because I kind of understood, the fortress I was trying to hold. It was just keeping the king from coming into c5. When my king is on c3, then king c5 is always met with bishop e3 check, and the king just has to go back. But yeah, we did a little bit dancing around, and somehow I just kind of confused myself out of making the right move. So yeah, I felt like, at this point after king c5, it's basically a losing position. Like, objectively, white has no way of defending as long as black keeps making progress and can find a way to break through. And I felt like the biggest mistake I made here, apart from just all of these like small individual mistakes, was really just not spending enough time on the position. Like, I think I still had enough time at this point to really dig deep and try to figure out, exactly how I'm supposed to hold. And I don't think it was such a big ask to figure out this idea, just to play bishop e3, cover the c5 square, and then switch back bishop d2 only when the pawn is actually hanging and black has to react to this attack. So yeah, the main mistake here, I think, was just kind of a little bit of sloppiness on my end. Okay, so after king c5, bishop e1, I mean, I think Gauri, despite not having a lot of time, like 2-3 minutes, I think he just, he used the increment and he was able to convert pretty smoothly. b4 was played. I went bishop d2, bishop f6, bishop e3 check, king b5. Now the king is potentially threatening to come to a4 and a3. Bishop c1. He decides to push a4. And now the pawn is getting to b3 if black wants to, because any point I play king c2, then the king will get to c4, and things get even worse. So bishop e3, I try to stay put. Bishop g7. And yeah, now I didn't really know what to do. I decided to play e5 here. I don't remember what caused me to play this move at this moment, but the position is basically lost anyway, so it doesn't really matter. If black wants to, black could just push b3, and I think this b pawn would be enough to win the game. Even if black pushes the pawn to b2, I would have to play king c2. The king can come to c4. At a certain point, the king will just get into d3, e2, and white will just lose on the king side. The bishop just can't hold all this. I think even if black gives up the b pawn, it should be very, very close to a losing position for white. I think there are other ways that are probably easier for black to win, like bringing in the king to a4 and then trying to get in on a3 and b3. But yeah, basically it's already kind of a hopeless task, and black is breaking through. Another option actually is just to play a3 here. I think something similar happens in the game. White will have to play king c2, king c4, and pretty soon black can start looking around for zugzwangs and breakthroughs with like some b3 and a2 somewhere, as we'll kind of see in the game. Okay, so I decided to play e5, bishop f8, bishop d4. My hope was just to try to put this bishop on this diagonal so that I don't have to deal with black's bishop being on the long diagonal the whole game. Bishop c5, bishop b2, bishop f2. So black is now trying to put some pressure on the weaknesses from another side. Bishop c1, king c5, bishop b2, and now a3. I think b3 was also perfectly good here. I think at this point black has probably a number of winning plans. But what Gauri did, I think, is pretty straightforward. Bishop c1, bishop d4. Now I'm very close to zugzwang, because if the bishop moves off of the a3 pawn, black will play b3, so bishop d2, b3 is just game over. And otherwise, I don't really have any moves. h4 is met with h5, so I play king c2, black's king gets into c4, bishop d2. Now b3 is not a concern, but black continues to shuffle and basically shows white that white's bishop is short on squares. Bishop e3, bishop c3, bishop c1, and king d4. And another deadly zugzwang. I don't have any good pawn moves, I don't have any good bishop moves, and if I play king b3, then black's king just gets in this way. I'm still out of moves, and the king is threatening either to come to c2 and b1 or e2, and everything is winning for black at this point. So I played f5. I mean, game is basically over here. F4, h6, h4, and h5. So another nicely executed zugzwang here. It's actually a pretty typical trick. You know, if you're not sure how to time it right, you basically just want to mirror the opponent. So since white has already played h3, black goes h6, and now h4, h5, it's white to move again. And I have to move my king. I played king d1, b3, and yeah, it was a good time to resign at this point because black is about to promote. So yeah, what can I say? I mean, it was definitely painful to lose this game. I thought it was a little bittersweet because at least it was like a good lesson for me, because I really just kind of very sloppily just like walked into this bishop endgame thinking that it would be like a very easy draw and that I was just like shutting down the game. And I just totally, unexpected that it was totally unexpected that black could create winning chances there. So yeah, kind of a difficult but useful lesson for me, not to be so sloppy with these kinds of things. Unfortunately, it cost me, full point or half point in the tournament, because objectively, from the opening, game probably should have been drawn. Yeah, well, hopefully it's a useful lesson for those of you guys watching, like how easy it is, even for a reasonably strong player to go from a perfectly equal position to drift into something where you're in a little bit of trouble. And even though the endgame, wasn't actually losing, it was clear that it just wasn't easy to hold either. I think I should have been able to hold it around this moment, just keeping to the fortress idea with playing against the c5 square. But yeah, there's always some tough decisions you have to make when you're defending these kinds of things. And if you have to make 3, 4, 5, 6 difficult decisions in a row, at some point you might choose wrong, and your opponent just gets some winning chances and takes the game. So yeah, that basically killed my norm chances for this tournament. I was on 2 out of 5, but okay, there was 4 more games to go against good players that I wanted to do well in, because I mean, just because you lose one game or you lose your chances in one tournament, it's typically not the end of your career. So I think it's important not to see it as like such a huge disaster. And there was 4 more games to play, some rating points on the line. And I also had in mind that I was going to be playing the World Open next week, no matter what. So I needed to try to bounce back, and I kind of switched mentality a little bit, and I decided, okay, well, this tournament is now going to be a training tournament. I'm just going to try to get the maximum value out of the rest of the games as possible, and yeah, hopefully it'll help me in my next tournament. So, okay, hopefully you guys found this lesson useful. I certainly did. And I'll see you guys in the next videos. Take care.